Well, good morning and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly, and I guess I shouldn't say good morning, good indeterminate time of the day. I know many of you are listening on the audio podcast when you're driving much later, even sometimes a year later. We're getting listens from the episodes from a year ago. So welcome. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's adventure, today's class in the Bible, broadcasting live this morning from Cottage Lake, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And this is a Bible teaching broadcast. It is intended to be more like a classroom than a sermon. And so I hope that you find it educational, and just the headphone cord there is bugging me a little. Anyway, so a couple housekeeping things to get out of the way before we start. You'll notice there are no commercials during this. You can contact me if you have questions, concerns, even a disagreement about what the content is here. Email brian@thefootlight.com. You can call 866-988-8311. I will call you back if you leave a message. Live chat available during the program. That is on Facebook and YouTube. And then I want to make sure you can get the audio podcast. The audio podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. That is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. This is listener, viewer supported broadcasting, and so you are welcome to help if you think it's worthwhile. You can find out how to do that at the footlight.com website. Just hit the button that says support and it will show you how. And you can do that online. And then there are a ton of resources at the website also. Some links to other sites that I think are valuable, as well as all of the past episodes, now 59 past ones. This is number 60. So that is how you can help. And also, if you hit the share button on whatever channel program you're watching on, which is, Rumble, Getter, X, Facebook, and YouTube, or you share the audio podcast, that really does help, and I appreciate it very much. Also, if you subscribe to the channel on YouTube, that does make a big difference. YouTube promotes content based on subscriber numbers and views. So with that, let's get right into our content for today. This is going to be Matthew chapter 2. We are studying the life and times of Jesus, going to go through all four Gospels, and it will take us probably 2 years to do that. We'll see. But this will be the second chapter of Matthew today, which tells the birth story, or at least part of it, of Jesus. And just happens to be that we're close to Christmas time. That wasn't intentional, but just the way it worked out. So good morning, those of you joining on Facebook and YouTube, etc. Let's just get into it. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the Bible, and that we can study the life of Jesus and gain something from it. So, Matthew chapter 2 starts, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, these were men from outside of Jerusalem, right? They were not Jews as far as we know, although they might have been. We know that Jews had been scattered far and wide after the Babylonian captivity, and so they may have been Jews, but we just don't know. All we know is that they were from the east. Now, the story of the coming king, the coming Messiah, was widely known. So this Messiah that was expected to be very different from the kings that people knew, who had risen to power either through violence, through conquest, through nepotism, through inheritance, through gaining favor with some bigger ruler, right? So this is how people became kings. But this king was a king that was going to be sent by God. And so he was expected to be a greater king than all the others. So this story would have spread far and wide. And this would be one of the reasons that the Magi, no matter how far east they were, had heard the story, whether they had a Jewish background or not. And so this would be why they sought to worship him, right? This is a king sent by God. So we got to figure out who this guy is and make sure we're on the good side of him and give him the praise due, right? Now, the star that they followed, I believe that it was not a normal star, that it was some kind of other supernatural phenomenon. And the reason is because the normal kind of stars that we know of are too high to, be followed with any specificity, right? They also don't move, at least not in a way that's perceptible from Earth, so that they couldn't be leading, right? They couldn't have men following, right? Not the normal stars we know about. Now, some people suggest that the Star of Bethlehem was a planet, right? Because planets can be seen to move in the night sky. And although a journey from the east may have taken several months, and planets typically are not visible for months at a time, because their orbits are not, synchronized with the Earth's orbit around the sun. So the Star of Bethlehem, as near as we can tell, was some kind of other supernatural phenomenon than a normal star. And it also looks like it must have disappeared once the Magi arrived in Jerusalem and reappeared later, and we'll see that in a minute. It didn't lead them directly to the manger. We have these pictures on Christmas cards and other things of this star over the manger, and that the Magi went directly to the manger. Well, as near as we can tell, it didn't lead them on a continuous path to the manger, although it did lead them there, not to the manger, but we'll get into that in a minute. But it led them to Jerusalem, or to Judea, where they went to Jerusalem because it was the capital city, right? And they figured the new king, if there was going to be a new king, would be in Judea, right? So they went to the city officials, or to the officials of the synagogue, we don't know exactly whom, to inquire about this new king. And so verse 3 says, when Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, who was Herod, and why was Jerusalem disturbed? So Herod, this is, at least to me, interesting. I hope it is to you. Herod was an Edomite. Although his grandmother was Jewish, his father was an Edomite, and his mother was a Nabatean. Okay, his father's family had converted to Judaism, and Herod was raised a Jew. Now, Jewish ethnicity to the Jews in the Jewish leadership was more important than Jewish practice. And so Herod not being a Jew was problematic for the Jewish leadership. His rise to power was primarily because of his father's good relationship with Julius Caesar. He was appointed governor of Galilee first, and in Galilee, what Herod accomplished was he was successful in farming the taxes of the Roman state. He was a Roman Senate. He was good at being a tax collector and getting the money out of Galilee. And he also rid the region of bandits and opponents of Rome. And so both of these qualities were really valued by the Roman Senate. Now, there were a series of Judean governors. Some were in his family, some were uncles, some were cousins, and there were others. And as a result of some of these changes, he was deposed as governor of Galilee. And he fled to Rome to plead for another man named Hyrcanus to be restored to power over Judea, because he didn't think they'd appoint him, number one, and because Hyrcanus would have been known to give him his post back in Galilee. Well, in a surprise move, the Roman Senate instead appointed Herod to be king of the Jews and to be over Judea. And this is probably because he'd been successful in collecting taxes and getting rid of opponents of Rome over in Galilee. And the Romans considered Jerusalem to be, and Judea to be theirs to control as part of their empire. And they also considered it to be an important key link to the wealth of Syria and Egypt, that Jerusalem would be the path through for this wealth from Syria and Egypt. And so the Romans needed to have control of Judea and control of Jerusalem to be able to gain all this wealth from these other areas. So until Herod, as a practical matter, Judea and Jerusalem was controlled by the Sanhedrin and the chief priest. And so the Romans weren't receiving the taxation that they wanted out of this region. And they had difficulty getting goods and money out of Egypt and Syria. And there was an opposition party, actually more than one, but the biggest one was called the Zealots. And the Zealots were growing in strength, and they were actually doing kind of what we would call modern day terrorist attacks on Roman installations and so on. They were violent. A violent group who was acting in opposition to Rome. And so Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, was a member of the Zealot party. So in 37 BC, Herod brought a large army with Sosius, who was the governor of Syria, and they captured Jerusalem and brought it under Herod's sole control. Now, Herod had seen this kingdom change hands through treachery and betrayal, and he was determined to retain his grip on power by any means necessary. He was paranoid about the possibility of being deposed, and he even executed several members of his own family and anyone else he considered to be a threat to his rule. Herod was a brutal tyrant, and he was feared because of his merciless treatment of lawbreakers and anyone perceived as an enemy. He wanted to rule through fear, and he succeeded in ruling Judea and Jerusalem through fear. Herod had secret police. They weren't known to be police to other people, but they reported back to him and let him know what was going on and who were his opponents. Herod had a bodyguard of 2,000 soldiers. This included some who had been sent to him as a gift, as they were part of the bodyguard of Cleopatra, had been sent to him by Mark Antony, and this bodyguard was modeled on the personal bodyguard of Augustus Caesar. Now, the Jews hated Herod. They hated him because Rome had appointed him king of Judea, because he'd taken it by force, because he'd removed the Sanhedrin and the chief priest from their roles as governor of Judea. He didn't remove them from their roles in the religion, but from their roles as governors. He took control from them. And his brutality caused a lot of people to question his commitment to Judaism. So it wasn't only his ethnicity, but it was his brutality and also his bringing in of foreign forms of entertainment. And we even have a word today called hedonism, which is related to Herod because of the idea that it was so degenerate. Okay, now he placed a golden eagle, which was the symbol of Rome, at the entrance to the temple. And so this is, again, one more reason why people questioned whether he or not he was Jewish, because his practice would have been to honor the temple, not to honor Rome in that space if he were serious about his Judaism, right? Herod was also known for his building projects, somewhat of a genius builder. He built the Second Temple and the Western Wall of the temple, expanding the Temple Mount, and that Western Wall in Jerusalem still stands today. We've all seen, people going to the Western Wall and praying and putting notes in the bricks, and including former President Trump and other world leaders gone to the Western Wall. The fortress at Masada still stands today. That was built by Herod. He even used hydraulic cement, which was a kind of brand new technology, if you will, to build the underwater harbor at Caesarea Maritima. And so Herod was kind of a genius builder. And for this, Rome also gave him credit because they considered it to be glorifying to the Roman state. Now, Josephus, the Roman historian, a Jewish historian of working for Rome, stated that Herod was so concerned that no one would mourn his death that he commanded a large group of distinguished men to come to Jericho, and he gave an order that they should be killed at the time of his death. The reason was he wanted the displays of grief that he craved to take place, and he knew no one was going to mourn him. But when he died, his brother-in-law Alexis and his sister Salome didn't carry out his wish because they didn't mourn his death either. So this gives us context for why it says in verse 2 or verse 3 that all Jerusalem was disturbed along with Herod. Okay, we have an idea why Jerusalem was so disturbed, because any competitor to Herod for the throne would have been a target for this brutal king and a cause of a lot of trouble for the city. So this is why Jerusalem was disturbed. Verse 4, when he called together all the chief priests and teachers of the law, this is when Herod called them together, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Verse 6, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So this is a quote from Micah 5:2. And it appears that Herod was unfamiliar with where the Messiah was to be born. And again, this might add to the idea that he wasn't very serious about his Judaism. Okay. Bethlehem was the city of David, right? Which is where David was born. It was also where the Messiah was to be born. And David didn't spend his life there in Jerusalem. He spent it elsewhere, but this was where the Messiah was to come from, as predicted in Micah. Verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, Herod was lying to the Magi. Okay. He had no intention of worshiping a new king, honoring a new king. He saw any new king as a competitor, right? We know from his paranoia that he was really sensitive to rivals of all type, right? And it didn't matter if it was a baby. This was a rival to Herod. The last thing he wanted is for this baby to grow up and be successful, right? So what he was trying to get out of the Magi was the location of his rival. And he, more likely than not, wanted to have his rival executed as he had done with every other rival to his authority. Verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. So it appears that the star had disappeared, because otherwise they wouldn't have been overjoyed. They would have been continually joyed, right? If you will. So the star appears to return at this point. And this was probably not immediately upon departing from Herod, although it might have been. It's likely that since they were going to Bethlehem, that at some point in the journey to Bethlehem, the star appeared and causing them to be overjoyed because they knew for sure they were on the right path, right? So, of course, it was welcomed. Now, for a star to stop over a place where a child was in a way that you could locate Jesus would have indicated a pretty low altitude star, right? So this was, my belief is, a supernatural phenomenon that resembled a star to them, but was probably not like a star that we think of as obviously it wasn't a huge star brought down to Earth. And if it was a star way up high, depending on the altitude, it would be very difficult to pinpoint a location, right? I mean, we've all seen a jet flying up above, right? Which isn't nearly as high as a star would be. And could you tell me at any moment exactly what the jet is over, down to the very house? I don't think so. I think it would be very difficult. And so this star that was leading is probably more like some kind of leading phenomenon like the pillar of fire, the pillar of clouds in the desert that led the Israelites. It was some kind of supernatural phenomenon of light that may have resembled a star that, and for lack of another word, they called it a star. And this is probably more likely what it was. Now, verse 11 says, on coming to the house, they saw the child and his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now notice, it doesn't say the Magi came to the manger. It says on coming to the house. They came to a house, not to the manger. So all of these depictions of the wise men at the manger are just incorrect according to what the Bible actually says. And Jesus is described here as a child, not as a baby. And since it was a house, it's likely that Jesus was a toddler. Not because it was a house, but it's likely that his parents had taken up residence in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem, and that Jesus was a toddler and probably less than 2 years old at this point. And we'll see why we think that in a minute. We also don't read in this verse any reference to 3 magi. It just says magi. Instead, we have a reference to 3 separate kinds of gifts. And from this, people assume that it was 3 wise men, 3 magi. But it's unlikely that it was 3 magi only, although it may have been, we don't know. It was probably at least 2 because we have a plural term, magi, which is a plural term. And it could have been any number. It could have been, 20 magi. We just don't know. What we know is that the number of magi, however many there were bearing 3 gifts. Okay, and the gifts were gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they may have been bearing other gifts which don't end up listed here. We just don't know. Verse 12, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, we don't know whether the Magi were warned of Herod's plans to execute Jesus, or if they were just given instructions not to go back to him. But we do know that the Magi had been warned in a dream. And we don't know, but it's, in my view, unlikely that it was just one of them that was warned in a dream. Otherwise, maybe the others would have just said, no, it probably was more than one of them, maybe all of them who God had warned not to go back to Herod. Now, verse 13, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there till I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. This verse comes from Hosea 11:1, and it's another example of a double fulfillment. This verse in Hosea 11:1 refers to God calling his people, Israel, out of Egypt. He says, Israel, my son. And he calls Israel out of Egypt at the Exodus. And it goes on to describe how God frees people and heals them and has mercy on them, which is exactly what Jesus does. He frees them and heals them and has mercy on them. We see this echoed in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10, which is, for me, this is a fun coincidence. This is what my Thursday night men's group is studying right now is 1 Peter. And it says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light, who were once not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. And if you go back and check out the study I did on Romans, you'll see that the case that is made, and it's a good case, that the Israel of God today is the church. And so Jesus came to call the church. Jesus came to bring the church out of bondage the same way that Israel was called out of bondage in Egypt. And so this out of Egypt I called my son is basically the idea here that Jesus and the church, the body of believers, was called out of bondage and into his marvelous light. Verse 16, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Remember, he asked the Magi earlier to tell him exactly when they had seen the star. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And it probably took maybe as much as a year for Herod to realize that the Magi hadn't reported back. Perhaps it took as much as 2 years. We know that Jesus was a child and not an infant, and that Herod was likely to have gone back further than the appearance of the Magi because of his paranoia. So we don't know exactly what the frame of reference is relative to Jesus' age, but Jesus was likely, almost certainly at this point, not an infant, and Herod is going back to make sure that this rival king didn't exist anymore. Now, verse 19, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. Verse 21, so he got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, Archelaus was known as to be as brutal as his father, right? He'd learned from his dad that brutality and paranoia were the keys to maintaining power. And when it says that Jesus would be called a Nazarene, as was said through the prophets, what's interesting is that if you search through the prophets looking for someone who calls the Messiah a Nazarene, you won't find it. You won't find a prophet who says that the Messiah would come out of Nazareth. So how do we get to this idea? What you will find is several references in the prophets that Jesus would be despised and rejected, that the Messiah would be rejected by his people, and that he would be the object of scorn. And Nazareth was this small town about 55 miles north of Jerusalem. Galilee, in general, was looked down upon by the Judeans, and Nazareth was especially despised. And the Nazarenes, for whatever reason, were the object of scorn. They were considered to be the lowest of the low by the Judeans. Now, Matthew, because he was writing to a Jewish audience, it's doubtful that he would reference the prophets with an inaccurate statement, especially because we know Matthew knew the scriptures, right? It's more likely that he was using the term Nazarene to refer to one who was rejected and scorned. This is similar to the way we use the word Cretan, right, to describe someone today who is of low character, low manners. Boy, that guy's a real Cretan. Well, originally, Cretan referred to those from Crete, right? And it was a term of derision toward its residents, right? One of the names of the early Christians was Nazarenes. And the term Nasara, meaning Nazarene, is still used today by Muslims to identify a Christian. When ISIS, if you remember ISIS, the attempt to have a caliphate in the Middle East, the terrorist group, when ISIS captured Mosul in Iraq, they began putting the Arabic letter N, which is pronounced Nun, on the homes and businesses of Christians. And this was a signal saying, convert, pay the dhimmi tax, or be killed. So it's likely that when Matthew says here that he would be called a Nazarene, this is not as in a residence of Nazareth. It is as in a despised person. At least that's the best I can get out of that. So that concludes our study of chapter 2 of Matthew. So as you notice, I'm keeping these shorter. Please, if you can, share the audio podcast. It makes all the difference. If you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, it makes all the difference. If you can support the show by visiting thefootlight.com and finding the support tab, it makes all the difference. None of the money that comes in ever goes to me. 100% goes into the broadcast. And you can see, if you ever want, I'll open my books to you. This is a money-losing adventure for me, so not trying to do a money grab there. Anyway, thank you so much for your time and attention. Lord willing, next week will be Matthew chapter 3, and I'll see you then on the Footlight broadcast. Again, my name is Brian O'Kelly. Thanks for your time and attention. Have a great